Hello, everyone. I'm Roxana Velasquez, the Executive Director and CEO at the San Diego Museum of Art. It is my great privilege to welcome you to this fabulous Dan Meyer Gallery, where we are showcasing the Artists Guild, one of the organizations, support orgs that have existed before the San Diego Museum of Art was created, and that was fundamental, critical to create this beloved institution. The Artists Guild, as you might know, was always bearing in mind the excellence, the capacity to showcase visual arts in our community. Many of them worked around the city, around the region, and their pieces are located in landmarks of our community. Today, at our Community Engagement Gallery, here at MOPA in this facility, we would like you to go through their creations and to allow yourselves to be seduced by the power of art. The Artists Guild and the San Diego Museum of Art share the same mission. We all want to make art accessible to each one of you. I want to thank the teams, the Artists Guild, and also Hugh Davis, my colleague, for curating this show. Enjoy this exhibition.
The footprint of the Artists Guild, which has had over 14,000 members over 110 years, is indelible on the arts and culture of the region. The artists have been working, contributing, interpreting, creating from their communities, their neighborhoods, and they've brought that practice to the creation of their work. We are extremely honored to be able to bring the current artists' work to the inaugural exhibit at the Dan Meyer Community Gallery. Gallery's existence and the involvement of the Guild is an illustration of the sincere commitment to engage the community that Roxana and her team, Deirdre and Lucas, bring to San Diego. Their commitment is dynamic, electric, and inclusive, and their understanding of the potential of the Guild to be a valuable partner in the future of the Dan Meyer Community Gallery and the outreach efforts of the museum is well understood and appreciated by the Guild and its leadership. We look forward to continuing this process of exploration and implementation, which will potentially contribute in the next 100 years monuments to the skills and the commitment of the museum and the Guild artists.
I was delighted to be invited this year. It's a great honor to curate the exhibition of the San Diego Artists Guild for their 2024 exhibition. The Guild has been in existence for over 100 years and was one of the very first support councils of the San Diego Museum of Art. It was very exciting to see the response from artists. There was a wonderful turnout, and it made it a very considerable challenge to pare the number of works down to a manageable size for a very handsome gallery and to make sure that each piece had sufficient space. I was very impressed by the range of media, painting, sculpture, photography, drawing, sculpture in steel and in ceramic and other materials, and the overall very high quality of the work. The artists who are members of the Guild are deeply committed and very successful artists who have a strong affinity with the Guild from years of working together and seeing each other's work. So I think this will be a great celebration of an important institution and a great opportunity for audiences to see part of San Diego Museum of Art's new space at MOPA.
What is the Artists Guild? The San Diego Museum of Art Artists Guild is the link between the museum and contemporary artists. The Guild provides its members with exposure on multiple platforms. It has created a close-knit community in which gifted artists enjoy and learn from each other. During our history, we served the San Diego community as it evolved into the dynamic and diverse city that it is today. The Guild began in 1915 and helped found the museum in 1926. We are its original supporters. 48 Guild artists have over 400 works of art in the permanent collection of the San Diego Museum of Art. Let me take you on a virtual tour of iconic buildings, sculptures, and paintings that you can see and enjoy. They were all created by Guild artists. Kate Sessions by Ruth Hayward, 1998. This bronze sculpture stands in Sefton Plaza near the west entrance of Balboa Park. The Founding Fathers by Ruth Hayward, 2001. Their life-size sculptures are in Founders Plaza near the west entrance of Balboa Park. The San Diego Museum of Art Facade by Robert W. Snyder, 1926. This elaborate, plateauesque style of architecture welcomes visitors to the building that was known then as the Fine Arts Gallery. In 1978, it became the San Diego Museum of Art. Alcazar Gardens by Richard Requa, 1935. Requa brought red tile roofs and white stucco to the city with his popular Spanish Revival architecture. Point Loma by Charles Reifel. Reifel painted in the then radical style of Impressionism. This painting is one of many WPA projects completed by Guild artists. The Tehuantepec Woman by Donald Hord, 1935. This WPA project, made of Indiana limestone, was completed in 3 months and earned Donald Hord $300. Pearl of the Pacific Peace Park by James Hubble, 2018. Hubble was a quiet man who brought to life his vision of peace in countries rimming the Pacific Ocean. They were all created locally, each with a pearl at its center. Ours is on Shelter Island. King Triton by Manuelita Brown, 2008. This UCSD mascot heralds victory. Sojourner Truth by Manuelita Brown, 2015. She strides across the Thurgood Marshall campus at UCSD. She is life-size at 6 feet 1 inch. Liberation by Richard Becker, 2011. This 15-foot sculpture was commissioned by ex-POWs to celebrate the moment of their release. It is located in the Miramar National Cemetery. Guardian of Waters by Donald Hord, 1937. Another WPA project, she stands in front of the San Diego County Administration Building on Pacific Highway. Chicano Park Murals by Mario Terrero, 1970. Terrero destroyed old misconceptions and created new understanding and pride in Chicano culture. The Western Metal Supply Company Building by Henry Lord Gay, 1909. This commercial building was incorporated into Petco Park in 2004. It was designated as a historic site. It was designed by Henry Lord Gay, the first president of the Artists Guild. San Diego Central Library by Robert Wellington Quigley, 2013. Quigley's design changed the skyline of San Diego. Its 9-story dome is a beacon, drawing people in. The Artists Guild is alive and well today.